but she knew that she didn't like it. It made her doubt herself more, and Uhura wasn't one to doubt herself. She was the type that believed that if you doubted yourself, no one would ever be able to trust you. It didn't help that she knew full well that what she was capable of, and she refused to even perform at less than her best. Then she got her chance. She was going on an away mission with Captain Kirk. They needed a translator and had requested the captain. Other than that, no one else was allowed to beam down. She didn't really remember all that had happened. She just remembered pain and fear when the away mission went horribly wrong. She did remember lying in a steadily growing pool of her own blood when they lost their pursuers. The captain putting pressure on her wounds, desperately trying to keep her alive, keep her stable. He was whispering to her, and he never once called her Nyota, instead referring to her as Uhura when he was pleading with her to stay alive, and Lieutenant when he was ordering her to. It was disconcerting, looking into those blue eyes that were begging and pleading with her, the careful pressure and otherwise lack of contact, the way he took no advantage and simply spoke to her, no teasing, no calling her something she otherwise would not like, no jokes. She honestly didn't know what she had expected, but she was honest enough to admit that this was nothing like it. She was beginning to see what the others saw in him, and it was amazing. The hick from Iowa was gone, behind this strange, glorious man who begged the aliens, when they were found, to take him instead of his lieutenant, to spare her life. Then he did something else that shocked her. He used those skills as jackass, flirt, and genius to get them to allow him one last call to his ship. It was some of the most effective bullshitting she had ever seen. They agreed, and as soon as they had been locked onto, they were immediately beamed back onto the ship. The rest of that time went by in a haze of unconsciousness. That was what finally began prompting her to evaluate what he said and what he did in a different light, looking for a trace of that man she had seen. It was then that she finally noticed the fact that he was never serious in those jokes, that while he flirted, it was done in a teasing and jest, and often left the woman feeling proud of herself and lighter than air. The captain was taking interest, and the captain was wonderful. It wasn't that he was trying to be degrading to them. He was trying to compliment in the only way he knew how. He never meant it seriously, and even if he had, he was too professional to risk a relationship with any of the crew on his ship. Then Uhura began to realize that he was never serious with some of the stuff he said to her. More often than not, he was teasing, and suddenly the insults from the other captains began chaffing. What did they know of her captain? But Jim did nothing but bear it, tossing them teasing smiles in return, defending himself when he was able, but mostly taking it like it was owed to him. And that was when she saw something else. She was horrified to find that it hurt him. She was a master of all languages, body language, tone of voice, anything. He never said a word, but she could see the hurt. But above all of that, she could see the will to prove himself and his crew worthy. It seemed that that will was strengthened and never weakened, and that solid belief backing the crew up slowly pushed them into being the best crew of all Starfleet. He demanded perfection, and they were willing to give it. But there was one thing that she did not like or appreciate, the way he talked to Spock. He wasn't as bad as the Doctor, but he had his own ways, and some of what he said was a little more closely veiled. It was hard to watch, and it made her angry. She had broken up with Spock a while ago, this was true, but it had been mutual and no hard feelings were had on either part. It was a matter of work and propriety, nothing else. So she could listen to those words and pay attention to his tone and feel anger and feel anger for it. When Spock was captured on an away mission, she was distraught. Uhura had taken to wandering the ship, drifting from point to point quietly. It was only a matter of chance that led her to meeting the captain in the forward observation deck. Jim was leaning on the railing, his back to her, but his posture speaking volumes more than his face would. He was feeling guilty, helpless, and useless, and it was breaking him apart. He was so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't heard Uhura come in. McCoy had forced him off duty, telling him that a captain who was dead on his feet was no use to anyone. She had to agree with him. Now that she could see him off the bridge where he held his authority like a cloak, he looked tired. He looked worried. For a moment, Uhura considered leaving, and then the captain turned around. She had been wrong. She read more sadness and depression in his eyes than she had in his body language, but he disguised it with a smile. "Hey, Uhura, I thought that you were ordered to sleep by our resident evil dictator." Uhura gave him a small smile in return. "Last I checked, you were given the same order." "Couldn't sleep either?" "No. I'm not surprised." Uhura sighed and indicated the railing next to him. He nodded and turned back to facing the stars. They were quiet, not really saying anything, but the captain seemed to be hunching more on himself as time went on, and finally he turned to look at her with wide, blue, haunted eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get him captured. I tried. I did. But it's just Captain." It was the first time she had said his title without a hint of disdain, and Jim noticed, falling silent immediately. "Captain, it's fine. I know you didn't." She paused for a moment and looked at him closely. "You really care, don't you?" Kirk hesitated, trying to write it off with a sneering smile that slowly vanished under her scrutiny, and he sighed. "I do care, Uhura. He was my friend, too, and now he's somewhere, and I might never see him again." She watched as the facade further crumbled, leaving a man stripped of his mask and looking strangely defiant without it, but caring. He then straightened up and looked at her with an expression of complete and total promise and certainty. "We'll get him back, Uhura. I promise you that. The ones who took him have no idea what they're in for." She stared at the man before her, the honest certainty in his eyes shining, the blue bright, and felt something inside her crumble. The tears she had been restraining for days broke free, and Jim pulled her close after a moment of hesitation. She cried into his chest, silently berating herself for losing her professionalism like that, but it had been stressful. It had been so stressful, and she was so worried. He took it calmly, whispering to her that it would be all right, and handling it with a maturity that she hadn't thought he possessed. When she had cried herself out, he gave her one last squeeze and gave her a soft smile. "You all right, Lieutenant?" She straightened herself up, wiping at her bloodshot eyes and nodding her head. "I'm sorry about your shirt, Captain." He looked down at the damp patch and then back up to her with another smile. "At least it's not ripped." She couldn't help but give a small snort of laughter at that and took a decent look at the man in front of her, watching as he sort of shifted under her scrutiny. "You know, you're not as big of an asshole as you make yourself out to be." That made him flinch, and he cleared his throat slightly, but she shook her head at him. "I knew you weren't, but you make it difficult to tell. It's the little things like this that show your true character. Why do you have to make it so hard on yourself?" Jim hesitated, looking at her directly, and shifting before giving a brief sigh. "Did you know that I'm not how I'm supposed to be, Lieutenant? In another universe, the name James Tiberius Kirk was a name that everyone looked up to and praised. I'm trying, Uhura, but I really don't know the man I'm supposed to be. But I'm trying to be something that can be looked up to. But I'm not sure how." Uhura looked at him closely and then gave a small nod. "Whatever you wind up being and whatever you wind up doing, I'm positive of one thing, Captain. You're going to do it justice. You're going to live up to that name, and you're going to be what you need to be. I hate to say it, but your crew looks up to you and loves you. Even Spock seems to think you're worth something, and I'm positive you'll get him back." Jim straightened at that, slightly taken aback by her words, and then gave her a small smile. A true, pure smile that made Uhura offer one back. "Thank you, Uhura. I'll try my best. I think I can sleep now." With that, he nodded his head at her and turned to leave. "I'm glad. And Captain?" He paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "It's Nyota." Those two words split his face into one of his shit-eating grins, and his eyes lit up slightly. "Call me Jim." "You're pushing your luck, Kirk. Nyota said with a small smile, and he laughed and walked out. With that, Nyota Uhura fell into the gravity well that was James Tiberius Kirk, and couldn't help but feel that if this was insanity, it wasn't that bad after all. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to review. I'm not sure how I handled Uhura, so any critiques or advice, that would be appreciated. Oh, and don't worry, they do get Spock back. Wow, for someone who hated her character, I think they did a really good job writing her. I mean, geez, usually when people, well, I'm not really sure if a lot of people write fanfics about people that they hate, but most of the time when they do, they tend to vilify the character, but I didn't see any of that at all in this story. I have to say, this story was really, really creative. I mean, if this author hadn't told me that they hated Uhura from the 2009 movie, I never would have guessed it. The story was really good. I thought it was very well written. There wasn't any grammar mistakes. The paragraph spacing was great. They used proper punctuations. I mean, you know, this is an ideal fanfic. It was easy to read. You didn't have any speed bumps in there. It was great. I really enjoyed this fanfic. So, I'd say this fanfic is worth reading. If you're a big Star Trek fan, I suggest you check out Gothic Cheshire's fanfics, because I am sure this person has written other fanfics involving Star Trek. I'm not sure if all their fanfics are Star Trek, but I think some of them are. And I've read this author's stories, other stories, and they're really good, so I suggest you check this person out. Well, I'm the FanFic Critic. I read it, you listen, and I'm going to watch Star Trek. And I know, that was predictable.